Date with a Debut is a Words and Nerds and Breathe Art podcasts co-production recorded on a Wagbical country. And I pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and extend that to any First Nations people tuning in. Always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. On with the show.
My first encounter with Ernest Scott's A Short History of Australia was I stumbled across it. All I could think of is, what can I do to this book that sets the record straight, that robs him of monologic power to lie?
Welcome to Date with a Debut, a podcast about debut authors, their incredible books, and their journey to publication. If you are looking for a new author to discover or writing inspiration for your own story and you don't know where to start, this is the place to be. I'm Nick Wasiliev, author of When Men Cry and your host for today's show, and I'm delighted to welcome another debut author in today's episode. If you enjoy this show, or indeed any other shows on the Words and Nerds platform, jump online and give us a thumbs up, a 5-star review, wherever you are listening. Thank you for listening to us and for supporting the Australian book industry. You can also find any books mentioned in today's podcast down in the description. We're also excited to announce that Words and Nerds, including this podcast, has a special partnership with Booktopia until the 22nd of May, 2024. Order any books mentioned in this podcast down in the description from booktopia.com.au, Australia's local bookstore, and use the promo code WORDS10 at checkout to receive 10% off your order. See the description below for links and terms and conditions. Today I'm joined by Sharlene Allsopp, a Meanjin-based author who was born and raised on unceded Bundjalung country into the olive mob. She's been published in the Griffith Review, a Jacaranda Journal, Portside Review and Anico Press, and is the University of Queensland's 2021 Ford Memorial Poet. And we're here today to talk about her debut, The Great Undoing, published by Ultimo Press, which you can grab a copy of right now down in the description. Before I started talking to her about this incredible book, I started off by asking her about her writing journey and especially her incredible love of reading.
Hello, Nick, and greetings from Turrbal and Yagara country. I am just absolutely thrilled to chat about The Great Undoing today.
I'm so glad to have you here, and it is a great book. I'm very excited to chat with you about it. Usually at the start of these podcasts, I like to, ask you about your writing journey. But, in doing research for this podcast, I got distracted by your About page on your website, where you list a bunch of extensive list of books about your go-tos, and then you finish with the question, whose words tell you who you are? What do you think your words tell you about you?
What do I think my words tell me about me?
Yeah, it tells me that you are an exceptionally amazing reader, and I love that your go-to comfort read is Tolkien. Maybe
always. Always. And look, I think my words say about me that I have such a varied range of loves. One of the things, I met my husband when we were in high school, and we've been together for 32 years, and that sounds so boring, but he's honestly just so wonderful. And the biggest compliment he's ever paid me is that there isn't a room in the world where I couldn't chat the ear off somebody in that room. And I own that compliment because I love all those words. I change that page on my website constantly because I keep changing my mind about which books. But I hope that The Great Undoing shows that I love high concept thinking as well as commercial romantic fiction, and everything in between, poetry and archives and legal writing, as well as just a rollicking good story.
Oh, absolutely. It said to me you don't want to be put in a box. You will read anything that interests you. And that is reader goals. I myself, one of the great things about doing this podcast is, traditionally I was always a lit fiction person that was my go-to genre, but with this show, you get to jump into anything. And that is such a liberating feeling. So the fact that you're already there, just like I will read commercial fiction, I will then suddenly dig into Tolkien, then you will dive deep into Grace G. Coleman's work and examine that is just, I love it.
I just think it's such a privilege to get to look through the point of view of people from all different walks of life. Like, why would we ever be scared of that? That's something that just enriches our lives and makes me change my mind about things on a regular basis.
And that is an incredibly nice segue to a book that is about truth. And it is a book about that there are many voices to tell truth, which is The Great Undoing. To everyone listening, or indeed watching, I'm holding up the cover right now, which we'll get to the cover in a second. But first off, let's start off with your 1-minute pitch. What is A Great Undoing about?
Oof. Well, I would say that The Great Undoing is like a rollicking illegal adventure across the globe by Scarlet Friday, an Australian refugee. She's a Bundjalung woman who lives sometime in the future where the world's entirely run by a technology called Blood Talk. Her job as a truth teller in London is to examine the historical record and ensure that the archive is better balanced by inviting many voices into the record, so history doesn't get some kind of monologic power to prop up empires and power structures. But while Scarlett is living and working in London, and in the throes of an exciting love affair with a famous rock star, that technology comes undone and the world can no longer function in any way. The borders clamped shut. There's no access to information. You can't listen to music. You can't communicate. And she meets this very interesting stranger who together they sneak across the globe to get back home to Australia, but each of them have very different motives that become clear as the story goes on. And the final thing I'd say in my 1-minute pitch is that due to that lack of technology, she has to grab an old book and pen to record her undoing on the run. And she happens to choose an old faded history book written by Ernest Scott called A Short History of Australia. And she records her own version of history over the top, but she discovers that she has to reckon with her own past before she can decide what kinds of truths she wants to tell about the future.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Nailed it. You know, for someone who said that this was their first proper chat about the podcast, you've got the pitch down.
Excellent. I really just want to hear what your 1-minute pitch is.
Oh, God. Look, I really want to stay as spoiler-free as I can in these podcasts because long and the short of it, I want people to go and buy this book. But in this particular case, I feel like I have to be obliged to because of how juicy, loaded, and awesome this book is. There is so much to unpack. There is so much to digest. And it is, I feel like to unveil spoilers is a massive disservice because it's great. But I will spoil the opening line because you had me in multiple ways with the opening line, so much so that, like when you have a piece of prose that you like so much, you go back and read it again. The opening line for this book is, I'm gonna have it here and read it in front of everyone.
I love every second of this.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a thriving empire in possession of a stolen fortune must be in want of a historian. I love that in a story about the interpretation of history, things being included and omitted, you've taken pride in Prejudice's most famous line and messed with it. Where did this story come from? Where? I need to know.
Look, that is such an excellent question. And it's a really difficult one to answer because it began in 2018. Mm-hmm. When I had to do, I was doing a course at university where I had to produce a synopsis and the first chapter of a novel. And I did that. I invented this amazing story about a technology that came undone and caused a global shutdown where people were at home with no access to anything. And I just couldn't let go of Scarlett. The assignment was one thing, but I couldn't let go of Scarlett. There was something about her that fascinated me, and I just felt like she was telling her story to me as I was writing. Then, as I was fiddling with that story, I uncovered this unknown war record of my great-grandfather, William Olive, a Bundjalung man, serving in World War I in northern France when the Defence Act outlawed that. And the two stories just collided. And it took me a long time to realise what I was doing in the book. I wrote it non-chronologically. I wrote it in little vignettes and scenes that became those little short chapters. And it just took so long before I really saw what Scarlett was doing and how I could tell true stories in fiction.
It's brilliant. You do a lot with the book, even from a technical standpoint, just thinking about it as the writing headspace. You do this thing where you jump and forth between now times and then times throughout the story, following time in London, then getting back to Bundjalung country, and then you kind of intermingle that with this journey that Scarlett takes. Let's talk about Scarlett, the driver of this story. She's a historian or a truth teller. And I love that there's also, within this, there's also a connotation around modern discourse that kind of permeates through that. I mean, how can you not? With the nature of how things are in that technology space. I didn't want to, I feel like it's diminishing to also draw comparisons, but you immediately think whenever you have these sort of doomsday scenarios, quote unquote, you immediately think of something like Black Mirror as an example. But this is Australian Black Mirror, very much so. She records the history, she records those voices, and I love that through that you deliver this message that the key button, it feels like, at least to me, from reading this story, is that it takes many voices and perspectives to tell history openly and honestly. What was it like using her as the voice for that, particularly as the story unfurls and we travel further?
I think there was this huge weight of responsibility of telling this type of truth through a narrator. Mm-hmm. I felt for Scarlett sometimes. I had to work really hard to make sure she wasn't me,
yes.
And I'm not her. That was because the responsibility is so heavy. I am not telling anybody's story but Scarlett's, just as in my life I can't tell anybody's story but mine. Mm. But I think in constructing her in the way I have, I've tried to show the reader that Scarlett is undoing herself as she goes. As the world's coming undone, she's coming undone. And as she's telling stories in the big picture, she's uncovering and telling us stories that are personal. And this whole idea that the personal is the political was really important to me. I think when I realised that a truth teller's role in the novel was to include many voices into the archive and to reject the one-voice nature, that was the turning point for me, because I came to that real revelation that history genre is no more non-fiction than this book. Some of it's utter fiction, and using A Short History of Australia by Ernest Scott and giving Scarlett the ability to write over the top of his fiction, even though he was a professor of history at the Melbourne University. She never erased his words fully, though. She never treated his history in the way that Aboriginal history was treated by him. She still allowed much of his story to show throughout the book, to allow the reader to read Scarlett's history and Ernest Scott's history. And then as a discerning reader, I trust you to decide which one's more fictional and which one isn't.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about what you have done here with incorporating Ernest Scott. This is a real book, by the way. It's not. Ernest Scott was a real person. With the book A Short History of Australia, I have not read Short History of Australia, which I feel like in preparation for this podcast I should have, but this just from what was you have exhibited of it in this book. This was really interesting to dissect. The idea you have the voices running parallel, which seems totally in contrast to how history was originally represented, and it was interesting that the positives of this technology that was coming out enables for multiple voices, which is in previous generations was something that was never allowed, and often in real life held First Nations people back so much because they were so mistreated and their voice and perspective on country was discarded in such a way. Tell me a little bit about this relationship with Ernest Scott, particularly both within the book and yourself creating these two parallel voices that permeate through this story.
I think the best way to describe my first encounter with Ernest Scott's A Short History of Australia was I stumbled across it online for some kind of assignment, and I opened it up, and the first line, which The Great Undoing does open within the epigraph page. The first line is, "This short history of Australia begins with a blank space on the map." And the utter fury that just exploded out of me was just so shocking even to myself. I was so furious because I had just only recently discovered my own great-grandfather's war service. I had not known about that. Some members of our family had, but it just wasn't talked about. And it was brand new information to me that this Bundjalung man who wasn't allowed to serve had gone over to serve a nation that just was perpetuating his erasure, and that upon his return of service, where he was injured in very key battles in Flanders Field, in the Battle of Moquet Farm, he served this country and returned home to no freedom. And so I was already wrestling with that story. So to open up a history book written by a professor of history that erased our stories, erased 60,000 years of stories and history, and just basically declared them irrelevant, it was this fury. And all I could think of is, what can I do to this book that sets the record straight, that robs him of monologic power to lie about my family? And the idea came to me that, because Scarlett's living in this future where there isn't paper and pen anymore, and all the technology goes, I'm going to need her to find a book to write over the top of. What a perfect vessel for her to pour her history into. And so that was my response to Ernest Scott. As the time went by, I had no intention of allowing him to have a voice in the book. But occasionally, when you're taking a break from writing, I'd just flick through it and I would find something so rubbish that I think, no, I need to let that show through in Scarlett's book. I need the reader to see what absolute fiction white Australia's telling about my family and my ancestors. And I don't want to make any spoilers either, but throughout the book, I genuinely think you can see Scarlett's truth and then what Ernest Scott had to say about it. And I can't imagine any discerning reader thinking his history was anything other than a propaganda-style fiction.
It's ugly history is the way is kind of a good way to I view it as. Like the kind of reference on that history is something written by the winners, but history is not. It's a conversation, I think, not just with this book coming, but as a nation as a whole, Australia is given the last 12 months. It's a history that a lot of people are still struggling to come to terms with. Many people still don't understand, and it's what you have done here in the contrasting voice is you have presented an idea of history as how it should be. History should not be written by just one voice, because one voice is mono. It doesn't convey the reality of how human beings work and how humans function and the experiences that we all have.
Absolutely. And I hope what I've also done is shown you, without telling you any spoilers right now, that even Scarlett has committed that same sin of attempting to deliver a monologic version of her own history. We're all hypocrites. We all feel threatened at times. We all sometimes are guilty of staying within our own point of view and seeing things only from our own worldview and cultural view. So I hope that I've in no way tried to elevate my voice over Ernest Scott's voice or Scarlett's voice over Ernest Scott's voice. But the beauty of the many voice is that it just makes for a richer, fuller version. It doesn't mean that there's not one single word in Ernest Scott's version that isn't true, but how much richer is it, and not threatening if we're all allowed to be given the opportunity to tell those stories and have them all sit together.
Absolutely. You mentioned that, and I also just love the notion of you calling it was something that I picked up on early in the book about Scarlett being a truth teller, which was just interesting and loaded to me that was what she was referred to as, because truth takes many forms. You have, and right now we also seem to be in a time where personal truth seems to be conflicting with any sort of objective truth that we can all agree upon, and this feeds into this story. You touch on those topics brilliantly as Scarlett makes her journey back home. I want to dive deeper and talk further, because it is such a loaded text. Because I dig books. We were talking about this before we started recording. I dig books that look you in the eye and tell you to fix and adorn. You're not even attempting to be subtle in some areas, and I like that. You blend a lot of genres. We talk about, but I also kind of, in saying that, I wanted to allude to a discussion that you actually did with books and publishing, where you kind of rebel against genre categorizations, and I actually thought that was really interesting, not just because of from a book standpoint perspective, but also because it fits into the idea of the story itself very well, because genre categorization leads to putting books in a box, putting stories in a box, assigning a whole lot of baggage to said stories, which fitted like extremely well with the whole idea around history that you're analyzing in this book. Can you tell me about your basis and your reason behind why you rebel against genre categorization so much?
Look, I think ultimately genre is a marketing tool, and it's designed to reduce a story to a single label to help a buyer decide if a book is interesting to them or not, and to help a publisher sell them. But it's also even more powerful than that, because genre creates meaning in a text. And I can't help but think about, I'm holding the history book in one hand and I'm holding my fiction book in another. And so if I hold them up to a reader and say, this is a history book and this is a fiction book, which one's more true? Well, 90% of people are going to say the history book's more true, and that is a lie, because a story doesn't have to have actually happened to be true. Everything about Scarlett is true. Everything about her is real and is an amalgamation of all the experiences that many oppressed and marginalised people have had since time immemorial. And it's so true. And so that idea that genre is a tool not just to sell, but also to create meaning, there's something about how those things are telling me what to do and what I can write and how I can write that I can't bear. Because I think, again, it's not just many voices in history that gives richness and meaningful truth, but many storytelling styles that bring richness and meaningful truth. And so, as you've mentioned, I include many voices in The Great Undoing. I actually had to spend months and months getting permissions from poets and essay writers and prose writers and history writers, because I wanted every type of genre to be included. I included songs as well. And unfortunately, I couldn't get the permissions for actual lyrics. I really wanted sheet music, because that is a whole nother language. And that's, in fact, the closest language we have to a universal language, and genre is notes on a stave. So I wanted to rebel against the idea that one of anything does meaningful, beautiful things. We always need many. And so to use every genre just gives such a richness to the storytelling is how I feel. And I think for me, the books I love are those stories that blur fiction and non-fiction, like Claire G. Coleman's Terra Nullius or Tara June Winch's The Yield. You know you're reading fiction, you know you're reading truth. And I think that that's very meaningful and much easier for people to come to their own conclusions about, rather than telling them what to think.
I think I feel like I've referenced this in a previous podcast, but on your point, it's a point that Margaret Atwood makes when she talks about writing The Handmaid's Tale, and everyone said to her, well, you certainly have an evil imagination, for you made all these things up. And her response to them was, I didn't make them up. It's all real. And again, another reason why I just love that you've kind of rebelling against that, the idea of categorization, is because people assign a whole lot of baggage to it when you say this is a crime fiction or this is a historical book, and it can limit a reader's enjoyment of a story if you only focus it through that lens. They may miss the point if they only look at a book in a certain way, and I love that it permeates into what this book is about, and it forces you to address the book on its terms. And to any people who are listening who might have reservations about buying this book, honestly do engage with it on its terms, because this book has a lot to say, a huge amount to say. And Sharlene, I reckon you should be super proud of this book. You should be really proud of it. Because I could see you worked hard. You worked very hard on it. It comes through on the page.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I am proud of it. I probably have read it 100 times, and I cry every time at the same places. But thank you. It means a lot to hear that feedback.
I want to ask you a little bit about your journey to publication and actually getting this book out there into the world. tip of the hat to Ultimo for putting such faith in such a fantastic, deep story, and such a loaded story as well. Was there anything about the actual process of publication? Because you've been published in a lot of places. I could go on about it forever, but was there anything about the process of crafting and putting this book together that surprised you?
There's probably a lot of things I could say, but the thing that surprised me the most was how much I loved every single element of the process, because I was, it's obviously very nerve-wracking. I was lucky enough to win one of the Next Chapter fellowships with the Wheeler Centre, so I got a lot of wonderful help and support from them at getting my manuscript out to publishers. And of course, there were a number of publishers that very nicely and kindly with their words, rejected the manuscript, and Robert was all in. And there was another publishing house too who was all in, and they were really supportive, and it was a difficult decision for me to make. But I think then when I decided to go with Robert for all sorts of reasons, I was really ready to get defensive, to have to defend my choices and what I thought he would want to change or tweak. I was trying so hard to be open-hearted about it, but I was ready for that defensive behavior and to really hate the editing process. And Ultimo, I can only speak from my experience at Ultimo, but they were absolutely just joyful and delightful to deal with the whole time. And they even, Robert worked with me through the big picture structure, and it was such a wonderful collaboration that I enjoyed. But they also did get a First Nations editor, Ellen O'Brien, to then work through it with me, so we could make sure that we were really happy with certain just ways of doing things. And then I had much more narrowed work with copy editors at Ultimo, and I kept waiting for it to suck. But I loved every second of it.
That's the author in you saying, that is the most author thing I think I've ever heard anyone say. I'm constantly waiting for it to suck. I think honestly, that's what surprised me the most. I've just had a wonderful time getting this book to this point. I'm not surprised. Editing and crafting it and putting it together is one of the funnest parts, I think, because you've got this blob of a manuscript when people start with it, and then they mold it and craft it into something glorious, which surprises and surpasses even your own wildest expectations. It's brilliant, and I'm so glad to hear that Ultimo were all in. I'm not surprised that they were as passionate. And also, sometimes authors and publishers might say, push this more. Go a bit harder on this section here or this section here. I can imagine no author would have been like, no publisher would have been like, oh yeah, don't reel this back. You like reading it, I'm like, yeah, I can see that they would have been all in on just the way that the story progressed and how it worked. What's next for you? Is there another book?
Well, unfortunately, I'm one of those terrible authors that always thinks that what they've just done is so fabulous they could never do it again. That's it. I'm done. I'm washed up. I've done my best and it's all over for me now. But no, I'm not acting upon my feelings. I am making wise decisions, and I'm actually enrolled to start my master's in creative writing. I'll start in April with UQ, and that's going to very specifically be about genre in Australian writing, and I'll use that opportunity to produce my next book. I'm also working on a third book, which is much more fiction in the style of The Great Undoing, but I don't want to give any spoilers or anything, mostly because they both might change shape a lot.
Of course, absolutely. Well, hey, if The Great Undoing is anything to go by, I'm going to be waiting with bated breath for the next one. It's super exciting to hear that you're going to work on books back to back. That's exciting and daunting and terrifying in every way, shape and form. So
amen to that. Yes, that's all true.
Best of luck.
Thank you so much.
We'll finish the podcast with what I like to call the rapid fire question part of the date, where I fling questions at you and you give me the first answer that comes to your head. And I have allowed you to prep for the first two particular questions, which I do for all of our guests. And I find it's going to be a particularly difficult question to ask you because you are so red swept and interesting. You read so much. So what is your favourite book that you have read in the last 12 months?
I'm just going to say the first thing that comes to mind, which is Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens by Chankari Chandran, because I found it so beautiful and heartbreaking and harrowing at exactly the same time. And that's my favourite thing to read, when something can tell you really difficult truths and yet you still see the beauty in it.
Oh, beautiful. Love it. What is your favourite debut of all time? What's the best debut book you've ever read? Because I think we mentioned one earlier in the podcast, but what's one that just you go, wow, talk about an entrance?
Look, I read it when I was like 17, and it's Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen.
I love it.
It met me where I was at the time, and I loved the humour. And funnily enough, now at this age, when I look back, I didn't know it at the time, but I think what I loved was that she created Willoughby, the villain, but she didn't make you hate him. Mm-hmm. And there was something in that gripped me, that people are not all one thing or another. They can be both. I didn't know that at the time, but I think that's why I love Sense and Sensibility. But I do definitely have to mention again that Terra Nullius by Claire G. Coleman just changed my life.
Yeah,
I will always, love.
Claire G. Coleman is so good. It's so good.
Hero worship from me, yeah.
Shout out to Claire. If you haven't read her books, go read her books.
Yes, and especially Enclave. Oh, it might even be her best. Might be her best. Yeah.
Okay, hard question. In line with the line of the podcast, with the book. Do you think humans actually have the capacity to honestly tell the truth?
The short answer is yes. That does not mean that they do. I think we do, but I think we just have to remember that the truth is always coloured by how we see the world, how we move through the world. I don't believe there's any such thing as objective truth. I believe there are laws that the world operates by, like gravity's a law. But as far as objective truth, I wouldn't, and here's my measurement, I would never be so confident that something was absolute truth that I would use that knowledge to oppress another person with. I would have to leave room for uncertainty. Now, having made that bold claim, I do also acknowledge that sometimes there are things that might be objectively true, like, for example, our responsibility to protect children, things like this. But when it comes to just talking about the concept of truth, I think we do have the capacity, but boy, we have to be honest with ourselves before we're free to really engage with those ideas.
Great answer.
Yeah, really tough. That's tough.
That's a hard question to ask, and that's a great answer.
Especially in these rapid fires. I mean, come on, Nick.
I know it's the amount of times people have said that was a cruel question. Why would you do that to me? What's your ultimate guilty pleasure read?
Taylor Jenkins Reid.
Good, yeah.
Yeah, Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, Daisy Jones and the Six, love.
What is your advice to someone on the topic of, this book is filled with First Nations storytelling, First Nations perspectives. What is your advice to someone who wants to engage with the world with First Nations and just doesn't know where to start?
Well, I tell you where you can start. On every single shortlist for every major literary prize in this country. Start there, and you can't go wrong.
Amen. Or reach out to a whole bunch of, engage with a whole bunch of incredible storytellers who exist out there. We've mentioned a couple already in this podcast. There's a lot of brilliant storytellers out there. I would also, on the topic of them, like to shout out another one, Evelyn Araluen. So incredible. Read Drop Bear, her collection of poetry. It's extremely good. And she's
magic.
Great. She's
absolutely. Yeah. I've had the pleasure of meeting Evelyn, and I don't know her well, but yeah, you'd absolutely want to sit at her feet and learn from every word she says.
Absolutely. Final question, and sticking with the horrible, tough, mean questions off the back of this. What, in your opinion, is the meaning of life?
Okay, I'm going to quote my daughter on this. Sarah's really just going to love this. My daughter Sarah, she's 24, and her and I were having this amazing chat over coffee a few weeks ago, and she was really upset about a conversation she'd had with an older person. And that conversation went along the lines of something like this, I had to suffer that, so you should have to as well. And Sarah said to me something just so profound that has really stuck with me. At 24 years of age, she said, Mum, if I've suffered something, my whole goal in life is to make sure that no one else ever has to suffer that too. And I think that is the meaning of life for me, that we're a team, that, we're not free unless we're all free. We're all human beings together. There's one race on this earth, and that's the human race. And that can sound really big and really airy-fairy, but actually on a day-to-day level, when you're engaging with other human beings, to have that revelation that we're in it together, and how can I be kind to the person in front of me, which doesn't always mean you have to be nice, but how can I be kind? How can I treat other people the way I would want to be treated? I think I used an awful lot of words there, but it's something like that.
Kindness and happiness, I think, is the thing that really is what matters. I think that's so sad Sarah had to have a conversation like that, because it seems that it's such a conversation that sounds so divisional and so against the idea.
Absolutely, yeah. I just think that seeking to alleviate another person's pain, if it's within your ability, is just a great way to spend your life. Yeah.
I love that. I love it. To everyone listening, go and check out The Great Undoing. There'll be a copy to it in the description. Sharlene, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure chatting to you today.
Look, ditto right back at you. You're my favourite person in the world right now because of all the nice things you've said about my book.
Oh, shucks. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Date with a Debut, and for listening to the Words and Nerds channel. You can buy all books mentioned in today's episode down in the description box, and if you enjoyed the show, or indeed any episode of Words and Nerds, drop us a review, leave us 5 stars or a thumbs up. It is hugely appreciated. Catch you soon. Well, I'm actually now curious. I'm actually now just curious what your favourite word is.
Well, it's in the novel, and my favourite word is gincident, an event that occurs after too many gins.
Oh my God, I forgot about that. Brilliant. I now actually have a visceral memory of reading it in bed and then coming across gincident and being like, oh yeah, I should use that in general conversation. That's a good one.
It's a cracking word.